So today we're going to be wrapping up a discussion on a sutta. This Sunday morning for the last couple months has been a sutta study. And if you're new to Buddhism, the suttas are kind of like the Buddhist scriptures, for a lack of a better word. They're the texts that we eventually recorded in writing, but were an oral tradition for 400 years after the Buddha's death. And so we thought, hey, why not? We've got a whole lot of them. It's something like maybe 10,000 pages, I forget. It's a tremendous amount of literature, so why not look at some of them and explore them together? And so this is the third class that I'm teaching on a sutta called The Two Types of Thought, and we're going to pick up and wrap it up. And so the two kinds of thought, I'm going to read it here in a moment. It's a sutta, just to give you a little context before we read it, where the Buddha's talking to his students. He calls them bhikkhus, which means monks. But when I read it, you can think of yourself as a bhikkhu. And in this sutta, he is recounting a time before his awakening where he took on a practice, a mindfulness practice. And he's telling the monks about this practice that he did, and he's kind of encouraging them to do this practice. And in the practice, he separates his thoughts into two categories. And so that's all you need to know. He's talking to monks. He's talking about a time before he was awakened when he undertook a practice. And he is teaching them about this practice and encouraging them to do it. And you can take this on as a mindfulness exercise. I took out some of the repetitiveness of it. Remember, it was an oral tradition, and repetition is not only good to remember text over hundreds of years, but also to remember teachings. And so I'll read it to you. It's called The Two Kinds of Thought. Thus I have heard, on one occasion, the Blessed One was living in Swati in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus. Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir, they replied. The Blessed One said this. Bhikkhus, before my enlightenment, while I was still only an unenlightened bodhisattva, it occurred to me, suppose I divide my thoughts into two classes, and I set on one side thoughts of craving, ill will, and cruelty, and I set on the other side thoughts of renunciation, loving kindness, and compassion. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, resolute, a thought of craving arose in me. I understood it. This is a thought of craving. It has arisen in me. It leads to my affliction. It leads to others' affliction. It leads to the affliction of both. It obstructs wisdom. It causes me difficulties, and it leads away from awakening. When I considered this leads to my affliction, the thought subsided in me. When I considered this leads to others' affliction, the thought subsided in me. And when I considered that this craving leads to the affliction of both myself and others, it subsided in me. When I considered it obstruct my wisdom, caused me difficulties, and led away from awakening, it subsided in me. Whenever a thought of craving arose in me, I recognized it, I abandoned it, I removed it, and I did away with it. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of ill will arose in me, and a thought of cruelty arose in me. I understood these thoughts. These thoughts of ill will and cruelty have arisen. They lead to my affliction, to others' affliction, and the affliction of both. They obstruct my wisdom, cause me difficulties, and lead away from awakening. When I considered these thoughts of cruelty and ill will, they subsided in me. Whenever a thought of ill will and cruelty arose in me, I recognized it, I abandoned it, I removed it, I did away with it. Bhikkhus, whenever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon in their mind, that will become the inclination of their mind. If they frequently think and ponder upon thoughts of craving, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty, they have abandoned thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of loving kindness, and thoughts of compassion. Just as in the last month of the rainy season in autumn, when the crops thicken, a cowherd would guard his cows by constantly tapping and poking them on the side, and that with a stick to check them and curb them. Why is that? Because the cowherd sees that he could be flogged, imprisoned, fined, or blamed if he let his herd stray into the crops. So too, I saw in these unwholesome and unskillful states of craving, ill will, and cruelty, there was danger, degradation, defilement in these states. But in the states of loving kindness, renunciation, and compassion, there was cleansing and reward. As I abided thus, diligent, ardent, and resolute, a thought of renunciation, a thought of loving kindness, a thought of compassion arose in me. I understood this thought of renunciation, loving kindness, or compassion has arisen. It does not lead to my affliction. It does not lead to others' affliction or to both. And it aids in my wisdom. It doesn't cause me difficulties, and it leads to awakening. If I think and ponder upon this thought for even a night or a day or a night and a day, I see nothing to fear from it. But if I overthink, I will tire myself out and my mind will become strained. So instead, I steadied my mind internally and I focused. I quieted it. I brought it to singleness and concentrated it. Why is that? So that my mind wouldn't be strained. Bhikkhus, whatever a bhikkhu frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of their mind. If they frequently think and ponder upon thoughts of renunciation, loving kindness, and compassion, they have abandoned thoughts of craving, ill will, or cruelty to cultivate the thought of renunciation, loving kindness, or compassion, and then their mind inclines to those thoughts. Just as in the last month of the hot season, when all the crops had been brought inside the villages, a cowherd would guard his cows while staying at the root of a tree or out in the open, since he needs only be mindful that the cows are there, and he doesn't need to guard them from the crops. So too, there was need for me to only be mindful that these states are here or not there. Tireless energy was aroused in me, and unremitting mindfulness was established. My body was tranquil and untroubled. My mind was concentrated and unified. What should be done for his students out of compassion by a teacher who seeks their welfare and his compassion for them? There are these roots of trees, bhikkhus, these empty huts. Meditate. Do not delay. You might regret it later. This is my instruction to you. This is what was said by the Blessed One. The bhikkhus were satisfied and delighted in his words. So the Buddha here is speaking to his students. That's us. And he's recounting this time before he woke up where he took on this practice. He separated his thoughts into two categories. In the first basket, we have unskillful thoughts. Thoughts of craving, thoughts of ill will, and thoughts of cruelty. In the second basket, we have skillful thoughts. Thoughts of renunciation, thoughts of loving kindness, thoughts of compassion. So why does the Buddha want us to separate our thoughts into these two categories? And there are two reasons he gives that are, I think, really important, actually, for understanding the practice and also understanding maybe the purpose of why the Buddha teaches the Dharma. So why do we want to separate our thoughts into two categories? The first reason the Buddha gives, which is kind of subtle, but it's because it's for the purpose of our welfare and happiness, the welfare and happiness of others, and the welfare and happiness of the world. So he says we should undertake this practice for our benefit and for the benefit of others and for the benefit of the world. And this is really important. This is the subtle thing that I notice in this teaching, is that the Buddha defines cruelty, craving, and ill will not as immoral thoughts or sinful thoughts. He defines them as unskillful thoughts. And this word in Pali Sanskrit is akusala. And how he defines unskillful is if you observe these thoughts over time, a night, a day and a night, if you observe them over time, you'll see that they lead to your affliction, the affliction of others, and the affliction of both. And this is really important because what the Buddha is saying is we're not passing judgment on the types of thoughts that occur in our mind. He's asking us to do something, I think, a little bit more demanding than that. He's asking us to investigate when you follow these thoughts or these speech, this action, which are other parts of the Eightfold Path. When you follow these things out, what's the result? What's the outcome? And he says in another sutta, only when you have seen for yourself these things don't lead to my welfare and happiness. He says, not based on what the teacher tells you. He literally says this in a sutta. He says, not because a text tells you or a teacher tells you. He says, only when you know for yourself these thoughts don't serve me, then you should abandon them. And so the purpose of me saying this is the Buddha is really interested in curiosity. He's really interested in investigating our thoughts with curiosity, not with judgment, not with a moral feeling of shame or that I'm a bad person because I have a thought that I hate that person or that I want to steal that candy bar or whatever it may be, right? You don't wake up in the morning and tell your mind to think. You don't choose it. It does that on its own. But the Buddha is saying a second thing here that's really important, why we want to separate our thoughts into two categories. It's because he says whatever you think and ponder upon will become the habit of your mind. He says that what you're thinking and actively choosing to engage with in the thoughts in your mind, those gather momentum. They get stronger. And we know this. This is actually really simple. It's not some type of esoteric teaching. It's like the other night I was preparing for the Buddhist study series, and I put it off. And fortunately, I had most of the content from the previous 3 times I had done the Buddhist study series and put it off till the last minute. But I had a couple slides, PowerPoint slides I needed to get done, and so I was up at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and I tend to have pretty firm boundaries about working at night. I don't like to work in general. And so, which is why I was up at 10 o'clock at night doing work. But actually had a good time and talked to my partner I was doing the study series with. Everything was fine and had a good time and I got it done. But I noticed that I had dreams about group ideas and dreams about the content that I was doing. And I felt kind of stressed in my dream. I woke up in a state of feeling stressed out. Like my first thought was a thought of something that I needed to do in the group. And it was an unconscious thought, or what in Buddhism we would call a non-volitional thought. It wasn't a thought that I chose. It wasn't a thought that I actively sought in my mind. It was a thought that just seemed to arise on its own. That was conditioned by the previous night's mental activity. And so we can think of the Buddha really as a psychologist in a way. You know, and he's telling us 2 things here. Why do you want to separate your thoughts into 2 categories? To see whether they lead to your affliction or the affliction of others or both. And also to see that what thoughts you choose to follow gain momentum and habit energy in your mind. They get reinforced. They get stronger, like streams that you add to. So the Buddha is interested in seeing the cause and effect relationship between thoughts and peace, or thoughts and suffering. And the tool that the Buddha holds out to us to use to help us towards peace, for ourselves, for others, and both, is mindfulness. Without active awareness, we don't examine thoughts, we follow them. That's been my experience. And mindfulness is a part of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. The last 3 factors of the Eightfold Path effort, mindfulness, and concentration are all about meditation. And so I wanted to talk about this sutta, and I wanted to talk about the factor, the Eightfold Path factor of wise effort and how it relates here. The first thing I want to say is that we all know that having this type of awareness, like if you just think about this sutta and the Buddha's like, all right, separate your thoughts. You're like, well, which one? I have so many. Right? You want me to do this all the time? And probably the Buddha's answer would have been yes, but here we are, 21st century America, so we'll give ourselves a break. But which thoughts, right? Like, one of the things in looking at effort is that it actually takes effort, it takes active awareness to be mindful. I don't know about you, but it doesn't happen automatically for me. Now, the cool thing is I can condition through mindfulness practice, also through how I set up my life. The Buddha talks about wise livelihood. He talks about, there's this whole other part of the Eightfold Path that's about how we live in the world. But that all of these things, my meditation practice and my environment, how I structure my life, set me up to be more mindful. And that's what I'm about to talk about in a second. But also we just need to acknowledge that it takes a little bit of active awareness. I've got to do it. But here's something I really want to say that I think is very important, especially for us Westerners, and it goes to the comment that was shared earlier, is the type of effort that we need to be mindful is not a strained effort. It's not an effort of accomplishing, possessing, getting somewhere, doing something. It's an effort that's actually a minimal effort required to just be aware of being here. The effort we use in meditation is just the effort that we need to be present. That's it. And Sayadaw U Tejaniya, who's a meditation teacher that I love very much, he's a Burmese guy that I think really understands the Western mind because he's very laid back to counteract a lot of our perfectionism and our drive. And he said about effort in meditation, he says, when the Buddha's talking about wise effort, it means the type of effort to keep reminding yourself to be aware, and that's it. He says wise effort, from a Buddhist perspective, is just persistent effort. It is not energy that you use to focus hard on something. It is an effort which is simply directed at remaining aware. It's not difficult to be aware or mindful, he says, but it is difficult to maintain it continuously. For this, you need the factor of wise effort, which is simply perseverance. So he's saying it's not difficult to be aware or mindful, it's difficult to maintain it. Have you noticed this when you meditate? When you come in today and I say, okay, just notice the sounds. Notice the sound of the bell to get started. How much effort does that take just to... I don't really feel like I have to do that much. I'm still listening to it. All right, now give me 10 seconds and my mind's going to go somewhere else. And then I got to come back. So he's saying it's not difficult to be mindful, to be aware. It's difficult to maintain it continuously. Our practice is to remember to come back. The word for mindfulness in Pali Sanskrit, sati, means to remember. It doesn't mean mindfulness. It literally means to remember. And what do we need to remember? Remember to be aware. Remember to show up in this moment with curiosity. How is it right now? That's a moment of mindfulness. Now, awareness alone is not enough, unfortunately. And this is what I talked a little bit about last time I want to really go into here, is that we need to make an effort to be aware, but I don't know if you've noticed, awareness isn't always good news. Once you start becoming aware, you start really noticing more moments of your mind's neurotic struggle and comparison and self-doubt and criticism. And what do we do with all of this awareness that we have? And the Buddha says, well, we have to actually use that awareness to cultivate discernment or understanding and compassion. To see clearly and understand what we're seeing that's coming up in our awareness. To see that thought of ill will, that thought of craving, that thought of cruelty, to see it and to really actually understand it at an intimate level, that this doesn't lead to my welfare and happiness. Right? So we actually have to use mindfulness for the purpose of investigation. And the Buddha calls this Dhamma Vichaya, which means the investigation of things, discernment. And we have to develop compassion, an ability to meet some of these painful things that we become aware of with care, with kindness. Some of these pleasant things that we become aware of with non-attached appreciation. The other day, one of my friends, I know he wouldn't mind me saying this, I just love and respect this guy so much. He stays in touch with me. We're not super close, but he's just a sweetie. I love him. And he texts me and he says, how do I stop my mind from being so critical? I haven't talked to him in like 2 months. And it was really great to talk to him. We kind of text back and forth for a little bit. And he was basically saying that he was having all of this awareness, which was really good. I mean, he was seeing it. He was seeing it, and he was even reaching out to talk about it. But he was just noticing how frequently his mind was critical. These thoughts of cruelty, right? And what do we do with these deeply conditioned patterns of our mind? Right? And I told him that I've noticed that my mind has never been less critical than the time of my life where I was doing loving kindness meditation every day. And we talked about loving kindness meditation, and we talked about how when a critical thought comes up, we've got to try to work with that thought. We've got to try to abandon it. We've got to try to cultivate loving kindness instead. We've got to try to maintain a view that's kind rather than critical. And why do we have to do that? Was I judging him? No. Was I saying his thoughts were immoral? No. But because it was leading to his affliction. And that's why he texted me. Because he was experiencing pain and suffering around it. It had become a problem. And so when the Buddha talks about effort in the Eightfold Path, he actually talks about it in this way. He says we have to use our discernment to prevent unwholesome mind states or unskillful mind states from arising, to abandon unskillful mind states that have arisen, to cultivate skillful mind states, and to maintain skillful mind states. And so I'll read it to you. This is what he says. These are the 4 great efforts. He says, there is a case where a monk generates desire and endeavors, activates their persistence, and upholds and exerts their intent for the sake of preventing the arising of unskillful qualities of mind that have not yet arisen in their mind. There is a case where they generate desire, endeavor, activate persistence, uphold and exert their intent for the sake of abandoning unskillful qualities that have already arisen in their mind. There's a case where they generate desire, endeavor, activate persistence, uphold and exert their intent for the sake of developing or cultivating the arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen in their mind. There's a case where they generate desire, endeavor, activate, persistence, uphold, and exert their intent for the purpose of maintaining the skillful qualities that have already arisen in their mind. This, monks, I call wise effort. So the Buddha is saying that it's our task to be aware, and it's not a strained awareness, it's a persistent awareness. And through our persistent awareness, our task is to prevent mind states that lead to our affliction and the affliction of others from coming into our mind, and to abandon afflictive mind states that have come into our mind, and to cultivate skillful mind states that have not come into our mind, and to maintain skillful mind states that are already in our mind. Prevent, abandon unskillful, cultivate and maintain skillful. So what does this mean? Well, how do we prevent thoughts of craving, ill will, and cruelty from coming into our mind? And I want to talk a little bit about both formal practice in meditation and informal practice out there in the world. How do we prevent these types of thoughts from coming into our mind? Going back to the sutta, one of the ways that the Buddha would show us this is that there's a cause and effect relationship between what you do and how you think. Right? And so I talked last time about this very, cliche 12-step thing I learned early in recovery, which was, if you don't want to get your hair cut, don't go to the barber shop, they used to say, right? What they mean is, if you don't want to get high, don't go hang around people that are getting high. So one way I look at this is, what is the quality of the people I'm surrounding myself with? One way I've heard this talked about by some meditation teachers is looking at they were talking about wise speech, which is one of the path factors, and they're talking about gossip. And this teacher had a really great observation. I think it was Joseph Goldstein. He said, I observed that when I witnessed that my friends were gossiping about one of our other friends, I felt less likely to trust them with authentic things about myself. And so this wasn't a judgment of friends. It wasn't saying, we all love to, as my teacher Dave used to say, we all love to go to the mall and talk shit sometimes, right? Right? It's but it's actually to really deeply explore. It's not a judgment that for some reason we like to gossip, but it's to look at how can we prevent these unwholesome mind states from coming into our mind? We've got to kind of be around maybe groups of people that aren't as invested in being unskillful, being craving, like my friends that were in active addiction. I couldn't go hang out with them. Not as a judgment, but because they were really engaged in craving. Being around people that are engaged in ill will or unkindness or cruelty in some forms or fashions. And it's not that I can't be around people or I need to avoid them, but in Buddhism we have this word kalyanamitta, which means spiritual friendship. It's probably good to have in your corner at least a few people that are wise friends. And if you don't have them, we're not perfect. We're kind of a pretty broken lot here at Wild Heart, but welcome. You could maybe find some of us. We're at least interested. We're trying. Today, at least. So, wise friends is a way to prevent unwholesome mind states. So that's informally. Also, just looking at the places and the things that we're participating in. One of the path factors is livelihood. It's not so easy just to say, get a different job. We understand that life is more complicated than that. But just looking at what elements of your environment you have choice over. So that's informally. Formally, practicing mindfulness itself helps us to develop more stability in our mind. It helps us to prevent unwholesome mind states because literally while you're meditating, you're noticing thoughts and letting them go and coming back to the breath. Right? I think of it as kind of being able to develop a boundary with the thinking mind. Not only just having maybe less afflictive thoughts in general, the more that I practice, but also being able to see them clearer when they come up and being able to tell them, go away. Right? So practicing itself can help us to prevent. And also going deeper into practice, when you're even like sitting a meditation retreat or even at home, switching up the form of your meditation. If you find that you're sitting down and your mind is very lethargic, for example, it's not an unwholesome mind state, but it's not a mind state that's going to lead to a lot of clarity and presence. The Buddha calls it one of the 5 hindrances, lethargy. And again, what do you do about the energy level of your mind? It's not cruel, it's not unkind, it's not craving, but it's affecting your clarity if you're tired. And so you can notice your caffeine intake. You can notice practicing wise consumption, right? You can notice maybe not a sitting meditation today, maybe a walking meditation, right? You can be creative with the form that your practice takes. You can be mindful in all postures, but are you intentional? That's I think the important thing. Going for a walk with my earbuds in, listening to a podcast isn't necessarily an intentionally mindful activity for me. So you can play around with the form of your meditation to help with some of these mind states that come up, like lethargy or restlessness. You can switch up the type of meditation, which we'll talk about in a second. And like I said, you can notice kind of consumption, what you're taking in and ingesting throughout the day. So that's preventing unwholesome mind states. And then the Buddha says we have to practice using mindfulness to help recognize unwholesome mind states that have arisen and abandon them. And this is really where the role of mindfulness comes in. It's the ability to develop discernment. How is mindfulness and just being aware of an angry thought or a fearful thought and having that awareness, oh, I feel scared. There's fear in my mind right now. How is that helpful? Because that's actually what the Buddha is saying. If you look in the rest of the sutta where he says, just as in the last month of the hot season when all the crops had been brought inside the villages, a cowherd would guard his cows and while staying at the root of the tree or out in the open, since he only needs to be mindful that the cows are there, so too there was need for me to only be mindful that these states are there. So he's not saying that you need to do anything with this mind state. That's really important. It's actually kind of a deep insight of practicing mindfulness. It's hard to explain, though. It makes my job as a Dharma teacher really hard. But how is it that just the simple of awareness of, oh, this is a jealous thought, or oh, this is a fearful thought, or oh, there's fear in my mind, there's anger in my mind, how does that help? Well, I wouldn't be me if I didn't have an answer. Try to have an answer, which is that what I said earlier is that the purpose of awareness is for understanding and intimacy. So then we have a choice and we can see, oh, there's anger in my mind. What's leading to the anger? Oh, there's fear in my mind. How do I want to meet the fear? What's a skillful way to engage with the fear? I want to understand the fear. And so awareness itself opens up a lot of possibility to engage with things differently. So we can abandon, but it's not necessarily that we're pushing thoughts away. We're seeing them clearly and they fall away all by themselves without the need for struggle. If you see suffering as suffering, you don't need to do anything. Once there's a deep recognition that this resentment that's playing in my mind is really painful and not helpful, not because someone else told me or because I read in a book that resentment's bad, but because I see it as resentment and I see the pain it's causing myself and others, I don't need to do anything about it. It tends to fall away by itself. So we also want to cultivate wholesome mind states. In formal meditation, these are things like loving kindness. I mean, the Buddha offers two: loving kindness, compassion. Also renunciation. Renunciation I look at especially in formal practice. Living a life maybe a little bit more simply at times. One of our precepts is taking only what's freely offered, not kind of like, taking more than really what we're being offered or invited to in life. So that's informally, but formally we can cultivate loving kindness and compassion as a meditation practice. And then we've got maintain. Sounds like the easy part, right? Once we've noticed that we have some loving kindness in our heart and our mind, things feel lighter, we feel more connected. Maybe those that struggle with mental health, as myself, coming out of a period of depression, it's like, oh, I actually do like people. I forgot. And you feel more connected, and it's like, oh, maybe I should maintain some of these friendships and reach out to people and maintain my practice at home, right? So I want to close before we open up to the group with just a quote that I haven't read in a while. It's an oldie and a goodie. It's one that I used to read a lot, especially when I talked about effort. And it's by Maya Angelou, and she talks about, I feel like she really gets to the heart of this. She says, courage is the most of all the virtues, because without courage you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. You can do anything erratically. You can be kind, true, generous, fair, merciful, or just. You can do any of those things occasionally, but to do that thing time and time again demands that you have courage.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.